Floch's conviction is not a sudden feat of madness. It is a quietly assembled architecture, brick by stubborn brick, built from humiliation, narrative, and a hunger for meaning. Here's what happens when ideology meets survival instinct. Look first at what Floch wants to repair. A world that has been shrunk and made unbearable by secrecy and fear. The Eldian body politic in Attack on Titan does not merely suffer threats. It has been made to suffer as a condition of existence. The wars teach a people how small they are. The revelations that follow of history, of cyclical slaughter, of the world's hostility, do not so much clarify as aggravate. For many characters, the correct response is despair, withdraw, a desperate bid for simple survival. For Floch, it becomes something else, a project. He wants not only to survive, but to remake the terms of survival. Where others see moral ambiguity and tragic necessity, he sees a program. This is the core of his reasoning, an ontology of emergency. When the horizon of moral possibility is reduced to annihilate or be annihilated, the ordinary categories of right and wrong shift their weight. What was once criminal becomes patriotic. What was mercy becomes treason. That move from contingency to categorical imperative. It is the sleight of hand with which radical movements have always operated. It is the leap from we must not let them destroy us to we must destroy them first. In Floch's mind, the leap is not a betrayal of ethics. It is the final ethical act available. This is why ideology for him is not abstract. It is sacrament. It answers the question, how does one live meaningfully in a doomed world? Philosophy then for Floch is not a conversation, but a practice that sanctifies violence. He borrows the grammar of faith. Certainty where others have doubts. Scripture where others have fragments. Myth where others have history. He supplies ritual. Rallies, denunciations, a communal identity forged against an enemy. The movement he helps steward converts fear into dignity. That conversation, fear reordered into pride, explains why men will follow him. But notice the cost. A politics structured as redemption through violence collapses moral categories. The attempt to make a just collective by erasing a perceived enemy is an old paradox. You seek to reclaim humanity by annihilating other humans. This is the tragic irony Floch cannot see from within. In trying to restore dignity, he undermines the very conditions that make dignity meaningful. Freedom, after all, presumes other people's freedom. By making the group's worth a function of its enemy's destruction, he creates a civil order whose stability is hostage to perpetual war. There is also something attractive to his argument, and aesthetics have power. It binds individuals into a mythic plot where each anonymous life gains meaning through the narrative arc of struggle. The seduction is simple. If your life is otherwise humiliating and small, becoming part of a grand story, even a violent one, is preferable to anonymity. The political philosopher Isaiah Berlin once suggested there are competing visions of value. The pluralist sees many goods. The monist seeks one supreme good. Floch is monist. He will not tolerate pluralism, because pluralism is a refusal of the one thing he treats as sacred: survival through domination. Consider how this connects with the show's larger moral economy. Attack on Titan repeatedly confronts us with the moral residue of statecraft, preemptive violence, utilitarian judgment, and the lie that necessary evils are clean. Characters like Erwin or Hanji operate in the messy space of strategic choice. They bend moral rules to save lives, calculate trade-offs, accept moral stains, where others grimly count bodies and accept moral taint as tragic necessity. Floch cleans the slate and says, moral corruption becomes moral triumph when it produces the correct political reorder. The agent who chooses violence is praised, not pitied. There is a philosophical lineage to this logic. Call it the doctrine of the sovereign exception. It's the idea that when the existential threatens, the sovereign or the movement that claims sovereignty may suspend ordinary law. Thomas Hobbes begins with fear and arrives at absolute authority as the price of survival. The same current runs through Floch, but channeled into a communal theocracy rather than a leviathan. The rationale is familiar, consent to harsh measures now to secure a future of safety. But the thing is, this is not the same as heroism. Heroism in the show often involves self-sacrifice for the greater good that preserves life. Floch's sacrifice is different. It sanctifies death so long as death is directed outward. The difference is subtle but decisive. The former says, "I will die so others may live." The latter says, "Others must die so that we may be affirmed." One preserves the social order, the other frays it into us versus them. Epistemology is the study of how we know what is right. When the sources of knowledge are narrowed to the enemy's demonization, the ability to weigh competing goods vanish. This is why his rhetoric attacks nuance with the ferocity of someone who fears being emancipated. Nuance is a threat to his architecture because nuance invites compromise, and compromise is deadly to systems built on metaphysical survival. Attack on Titan's political fabric also shows us the sociological mechanics that let someone like Floch flourish. War ruins institutions. Ruins beget power vacuums. Vacuums are filled by those who can offer meaning fast. Crises accelerate moral radicalization. When institutions fail to process trauma and redistribute dignity, movements that promise immediacy appear irresistible. It is less about the persuasive speech than about the social need. Ethically, the question the show forces us to ask is this: when the moral horizon narrows to existential terms, what choices remain ethically defensible? Is there a sanctified set of acts that survive the collapse of normal moral law? The show suggests the answer is no. When survival becomes the highest telos, instrumentalization ensues. Persons become means to security. The moral philosopher Immanuel Kant would be horrified. His categorical imperative forbids using humans merely as means. But when a polity adopts a telos of survival at any cost, Kantian imperatives are the first casualty. In that space, the utilitarian calculus, greatest good for greatest number, can be manipulated to justify grotesque acts if the good is defined as the group's continued existence. There is one more tragic curl to Floch's logic, the self-deceptive conflation of ends and identity. He confuses what we must do with who we are. If we don't fight, we can't win. This line, so often repeated in the series, becomes something different in Floch's hands. It is no longer a desperate mantra of oppressed people fighting to live. It becomes license. He takes the trauma of Shiganshina, the guilt of being a meaningless soldier among the rubble, the frustration of seeing Erwin die in a moment that offered no poetic closure, and converts all that emotional sentiment into a single doctrine. Erwin was right. Notice what this does psychologically. It replaces ambiguity with certainty, despair with direction, fear with purpose. Ideology becomes a prosthetic for wounded dignity. Floch's loyalty to Erwin is not moral, it is existential. Erwin is the first leader who tells him that fear is not something to outgrow, but something to weaponize. When Erwin says, "Fight, fight," if Floch had been present, he would have heard a command, an absolution. This absolution turns him into a particular archetype, the executor of tragic necessity. He tells himself and others that he is doing what weak men cannot. He approaches violence again with the solemnity of a priest officiating a sacred ritual. In his mind, mercy is a luxury only those far from the front lines can afford. And since he was at the front, bathed in the terror of impossible odds, He believes he has earned the right to rewrite morality. This is exactly why totalizing movements are so persuasive. They teach the wounded that pain confers wisdom. Floch, guided by this belief, becomes something dangerous, a man who feels morally obligated to enforce his worldview. He sees himself as the last sane voice in a world of moral cowards. Anyone who doubts the rumbling's necessity is, in his eyes, someone who has not suffered enough to understand the stakes. And the tragedy is, from his vantage point, that logic is airtight. From the inside, Floch's reasoning sounds like this: you have not seen what I've seen. You do not know what it means to be powerless. You do not understand the relief of certainty after living as prey. You are still hoping the world will show you mercy. I have already learned that it won't. He becomes proof of a harsh political truth. When justice feels impossible, retribution becomes seductive. Here the show also invokes a darker line from Nietzsche. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Floch's conviction is absolute. It is polished by suffering, hardened by humiliation, and validated by a world that indeed wants the audience dead. The poet W.H. Auden once wrote, "I and the public know what all the school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return." Floch embodies this cycle without ever naming it. He believes he is breaking the wheel, but in truth he is accelerating it. Here is where Attack on Titan's moral sophistication shows itself. Floch is not a villain. He is the logical endpoint of a world designed around fear. He is the predictable result of decades of paranoia, manipulated history, and inherited guilt. He is the product of a political order that framed survival as a zero-sum game, long before Erwin ever made his choice. To condemn Floch is easy. To understand him is harder. To realize he makes sense is uncomfortable. Because the moment we see why his worldview is coherent, we must also face the uncomfortable implication. In a world like his, many of us might do the same. Political psychology shows that humans prefer narratives with clear villains and heroes. Floch is the political unconscious of LDR given a voice, but to grasp him fully, trace how he repurposes collective trauma. The fall of Shiganshina becomes proof that mercy leads to ruin. The massacre of Malayan civilians becomes a necessary initiation ritual. When Hanji tries to reason with him, she speaks the language of cooperation and humanism. Floch rejects that language as a relic of a world that no longer exists. Her words are appeals. His are ultimatums. She sees possible futures, he sees only one. Floch's logic is chillingly similar to political theorists who argue that survival requires a state of exception. Carl Schmitt wrote, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." Floch decides the exception. The rumbling is beyond morality. It is a sovereign act. But unlike Schmitt, who saw the state as the deciding force, Floch believes sovereignty belongs to a person, Erwin. Floch is not simply another extremist in the narrative. He is sculpted as a philosophical counterweight to Armin and the moral inversion to Erwin. Where Armin embodies the fragile courage of moral imagination, Floch embodies the ruthless clarity of moral fatalism. Where Erwin pursued the future through possibility, Floch pursues it through elimination. They do not merely disagree. They represent opposite answers to the same existential question. How does a people survive in a world that wants them gone? Yet the show gives us reason to hope, or at least to see the other side of the ledger. Characters who resist, who accept moral stain while refusing the absolution of violence, demonstrate a different political imagination, one that preserves plurality and resists monism. That imagination is costly. It demands humility, patience, and the acceptance of vulnerability. It does not conjure instant dignity. It grows it slowly through institutions that can withstand trauma without turning to sacrificial logic. Armin's power is not physical force but imagination, the ability to consider futures that do not yet exist. He asks questions before drawing conclusions. Floch, on the other hand, refuses questions because questions create hesitation, and hesitation to him is death. Armin sees humanity as something to be preserved. Floch sees humanity as something to be carved into shape. Look at how each interprets moral responsibility. Armin, we need to find another way. The outside world has people worth talking to. If we choose genocide, we destroy what we are trying to protect. Armin holds on to the faint possibility that LDR can exist without becoming a monster. He believes that survival without moral continuity is not survival at all. To him, the rumbling is the total abandonment of the very thing that makes life worth living, the hope for connection, coexistence, and reconstruction. On the other end, Floch believes you're too soft to save anyone. There is no other way. Hesitation is the enemy. He mocks Armin's idealism as a luxury for people who have naturally suffered. In Floch's worldview, Armin's empathy is dangerous, a leak in the ship at the brink of sinking. Armin sees moral complexity, Floch sees moral contamination. To Floch, Armin's humility is a vulnerability. To Armin, Floch's certainty is a tragedy. This is why their interactions feel like collisions rather than conversations. Armin reaches for the world. Floch retreats from it. Armin seeks to expand what is possible. Floch seeks to contract it until only survival remains. Floch is the embodiment of what Armin fears he might become if he surrenders his moral horizon, a brilliant mind swallowed by necessity, convinced that the absence of alternatives is proof that brutality is the only path. If Armin is Floch's counterweight, Erwin is his shadow. Floch wants Erwin's effect: unity, purpose, forward motion, but not his ethics. Erwin carried the burden of uncertainty like a personal cross. Behind every command lay a question: how many must die so that humanity may move one step forward? His greatness came from the fact that he never believed his choices were righteous. He believed only that they were necessary. And even that haunted him. He lived with the weight of doubt and moved anyway. Floch takes Erwin's necessity but strips it of doubt. He inherits the burden but discards the humility. Where Erwin saw tragedy, Floch sees destiny. Where Erwin saw sacrifice, Floch sees opportunity. Where Erwin saw himself as fallible, Floch sees himself as chosen. This is the inversion. Erwin was a philosopher general, willing to stain his hands while praying someone else would one day cleanse the world. Floch is a zealot soldier, willing to cleanse the world while believing his hands are already clean. Erwin's signature tragedy is the burden of impossible choices. Floch's signature tragedy is the joy of impossible choices. Erwin sent men to their deaths with the full knowledge that their loss carved another hole into his conscience. He marched with the Survey Corps not because he was certain, but because he was willing to act despite uncertainty. Floch envies that authority, but not the anguish that came with it. In Floch's mind, doubt is weakness. In Erwin's mind, doubt is responsibility. This is what fundamentally separates them. Erwin, we gamble with lives because we must, but we must never forget what we've done. Floch, we gamble with lives because we must, and that makes us righteous. Erwin was a tragic adult in a child's world. Floch becomes a dangerous child wielding an adult's authority. Floch is Erwin without the conscious. Erwin is Floch with the weight of humanity on his back. In the end, Floch is a moral mirror. He reflects not only the pathological tendencies of an embattled people, but also the alluring virtues that make such tendencies contagious. Courage disguised as conviction, clarity passed off as wisdom, and the human hunger for meaning. He forces the audience to ask, if we were small, frightened, and historically humiliated, would we be any different? His path is not proof that violence is inevitable. It is a test of how fragile moral frameworks are under stress. There is a Nietzschean whisper here too. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. Floch's politics is that warning turned inside out. He fights monsters by becoming them and then convinces himself the mirror image is virtue. That inversion is the philosophical heartache Attack on Titan stages. That survival can be purchased only by sacrificing the moral currencies that make survival worth having.